Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and I do excuse my absence, but I was at a conference at the Safari Park on Thursday and Friday. Couldn't do the podcast, and I apologize for that, and I appreciate the fact that you find time to come and stop by. My weekend piece was about Ebola, and they always change my headline. So their headline was Ebola severity lies in speed of infections. And the terminology I use is the escape velocity, and I'll explain why. In French, vitesse de libération, and this is this fellow Paul Virilio talking about mobile money, but I think it applies to this very exponential nature of viruses. I said it's difficult to avoid the Ebola virus, especially since the cases in the US, which popped the virus big. Many folks dismiss concerns by comparing the optics of influenza numbers versus the Ebola numbers, and dismissing Ebola as just a blip on the global radar. I've recently discovered an outstanding contemporary intellectual thinker called Paul Virilio, who said the following about electric money. The effectiveness of electric money lies in its mass, which increases its velocity of circulation. Virilio claims that as the last post-industrial resource, acceleration exceeds accumulation. The escape velocity, vitesse de libération, becomes the equivalent of profit. He believes that acceleration and speed are the defining characteristics of our new world. So my first point about the Ebola virus is that it is not about the absolute number of Ebola cases. It is about its escape velocity. Viruses exhibit nonlinear and exponential characteristics. WHO recently predicted that the number of Ebola cases in 3 West African nations may jump to between 5,000 and 10,000 a week by December the 1st, as deadly viral infection spreads. My point is that we have not entered the parabolic phase, the maximum escape velocity phase, when the escape velocity is at its fastest, and therefore the comparison with malaria and influenza might make a nice infographic, but it's an irrelevant comparison. Another point to consider is the invisible caseload of Ebola cases which are not being captured by the surveillance system. WHO previously spoke of shadow zones. We have not yet received any data since late September around the Ebola outbreak, different mutation, in the DR Congo. I have a friend who's invested heavily in the DRC and informs me that Ebola deaths in the DRC top 500. Furthermore, researchers have identified more than 300 new viral mutations in the latest strain of Ebola, according to research published in the journal Science. It is a numbers game, and the more cases you have, the more likely there are going to be mutations that could change the virus in a significant way, said David Sanders, a professor of biological sciences at Purdue University who studies Ebola. The more it persists, the more likely we're going to be thrown a curve. The curve Professor David Sanders is speaking to is that Ebola, contrary to CDC protocol, is in fact airborne, or as an article posted by CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, defines it, aerosolized. Authorities insist that Nurse Pham was wearing protective gear, gloves, mask, apron and shield when she treated Duncan. So how did she contract the deadly virus? No one seems to really know. CDC officials are blaming an error in hospital procedures, claiming that it's a breach of protocol, and yet they still have no idea what that breach actually was. If that's the case, how do they know it was a breach to begin with? The CIDRAP report says, we believe there is scientific and epidemiological evidence that Ebola virus has the potential to be transmitted via infectious aerosol particles both near and at a distance from infected patients. which means that healthcare workers should be wearing respirators, not face masks. The non-linear and exponential rate of mutation of the Ebola virus gives the tail risk real bite. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in his book Black Swan, addresses the tail risk and describes it as follows. The disproportionate role of high-profile, hard-to-predict and rare events that are beyond the realm of normal expectations in history, science, finance, and technology. The non-computability of the probability of the consequential rare events using scientific methods, owing to the very nature of small probabilities. The psychological biases that make people individually and collectively blind to uncertainty and unaware of the massive role of the rare event in historical affairs. The rare event or tail risk is that Ebola has already or will mutate into a virus that has the potential to be transmitted via infectious aerosol particles, both near and at a distance from infected patients. The World Bank recently highlighted two scenarios: impacts on the region in the case of low Ebola, in which the disease is contained by early 2015, cases stay around 20,000 and economic activity gradually increases, and high Ebola, in which the disease is contained more slowly, cases reach 200,000 and the outbreak worsens significantly into mid-2015. In the low Ebola scenario, according to the report, lost GDP for West Africa as a whole is estimated at $2.2 billion in 2014 and $1.6 billion in 2015. In the case of high Ebola, estimates suggest $7.4 billion in lost GDP for 2014 and $25.2 billion in 2015. Both cases assume at least some spread to other countries. And I said the Black Swan outcome is considerably worse than the World Bank's high Ebola prediction. If you didn't see that interview I did, and it's mostly in the second half of it on Inside Story, I touched on many of these points in that interview. That was in August, I think. And I thank Laura Cowell for taking my thoughts, because it's nice to get a timestamp on things. And as I said on the 18th of August about non-linearity and exponential characteristics of Ebola, and I said on the 25th of August it's continuing to gain velocity. It still is. I'll put up an image of the Ebola virus, and then WikiLeaks have released an interesting report about how the US Army withheld promise from Germany Ebola virus wouldn't be weaponized. And this is regarding the export. A German firm has applied for the approval of the export of 184 genetic elements with nucleic acid sequences of viruses for the production of recombinant viruses. The viruses will be used in optical imaging to identify host factors required for viral replication. U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases, Fort Detrick, Maryland. And goods are controlled by the Australia Group, subject to compulsory export approval. This matter concerns the complete genome of viruses such as the Zaire Ebola virus, the Lake Victoria Marburg virus, the Machupo virus, and the Lassa virus, which are absolutely among the most dangerous pathogens in the world. The delivery would place the recipient in the position of being able to create replicating recombinant infectious species of these viruses. Because of the particular criticality of these goods, the German federal government practices an exceptionally restrictive approval policy for such exports. Home thoughts: we had a lovely time at the Daphne Sheldrick Elephant Orphanage over the weekend, and Hannah adopted her second elephant, this time called Begu, and I'll put up a photograph of Begu, I think. And there were 40 of these delightful little elephants, and it's such a sweet place. You just appear out, in sort of bushland, and suddenly you're in front of this sort of round sort of ring, and these elephants come in, and they're so lovely. And Hannah loved it. It was a lot of fun. I took a photograph of some flowers. I don't know what they are, outside the Mobile Plaza, Nairobi, on I think it was Sunday. And I tweeted Away because he's got this hashtag Flowers for Freedom. And if you know what this tree is, I'd love to know, because I want to plant a few of them in the garden. I liked this photograph from The Guardian of a flock of flamingos at Lake Nakuru. Brightly coloured birds congregate in their thousands, transforming the skyline as far as the eye can see. Political reflections. Renamo reject at the last release the Mozambique vote results, but leader vowed no more war, so that's a positive sign. Kobani, US drops arms and aid to Kurds battling IS. Drops of supplies provided by Kurdish authorities in Iraq were intended to enable continued resistance against ISIL's attempts to overtake Kobani. That's CENTCOM. On Sunday, Turkish President Erdogan said he would not allow Kurdish fighters to receive any transfers of American arms. I suppose these are not American arms, technically. This sentence caught my attention in an article in The Guardian. They wanted Assad to go, but now are confronted with people who want to take over Mecca and Medina. In a BBC interview, Nimr al-Nimr, who's been sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia, said he backed the roar of the word against authorities rather than weapons. In Iran, the foreign ministry warned on Thursday that execution would have dire consequences. Called Nimr an Ayatollah, giving him the second most senior clerical title in the Shia hierarchy. Iran, like Saudi Arabia, uses capital punishment. And there's been this enormous spike in beheadings, not only in Saudi Arabia, but all over the world every time I turn, whether it's sometimes in London or it's like a virus. And on that note, that took me to Saudi beheadings and this description in Yahoo. Immediately after his sword falls, the Saudi Arabian executioner steps backwards to avoid soiling his clothes with the blood of the condemned man, whose headless body can be seen slumping over backwards in the shaky online film. After perfunctorily checking the white folds of his robe for flecks of red, the executioner wipes his blade with a tissue, which he drops onto the corpse and walks away. A sudden surge in public executions in Saudi Arabia in the last 2 months has coincided with the US-led bombing campaign against the Islamic State. This has led to inevitable comparisons, I think I made these a few weeks ago, in Western media between Islamic State's beheadings and those practiced in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia beheaded 26 people in August, more than in the first 7 months of the year combined. The total for the year now stands at 59, compared to 69 for all of last year, according to Human Rights Watch. It's possible the executions were used as intimidation and flexing of muscles. It's a very volatile time, and executions do serve a purpose when they're done en masse. Any execution is appalling, but executions for crimes such as drug smuggling or sorcery that result in no loss of life are particularly egregious, as Human Rights Watch. But the interpretation of it as a show of strength appeared to be reinforced last week by the sentencing to death of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, a member of the Sunni-ruled Kingdom Shiite minority who had backed protests in 2011. If you look at the definition of what Nimr was sentenced for, instigating sedition, it shows they want to make sure they stop any form of activism, said Mai Yamani. Of the 59 people executed by October the 16th, 22 had been convicted for smuggling drugs, according to figures compiled by HRW. One Saudi man, Muhammad Bakr al-Alawi, was put to death, probably because of his name, to death for sorcery this year, the third such case since 2011, and the most extreme version of the Saudi death penalty, known by the Arabic word for crucifixion. Reserved for crimes that outrage Saudi society, the corpse is publicly hanged in a harness from a metal gibbet as a warning to others. I think beheading Nimr al-Nimr might well prove the spark that lights the tinderbox. I put up 2 images of a Saudi beheading that I found on the internet this morning, and then refer you back to that piece I wrote about the beheading of James Foley by a jihadist with a British accent, which then went viral, and I said that was rather spooky. The British accent, I mean. And they, ISI, are frightfully good exponents of this new digital media ecosystem, in my point of view. And what's interesting is the appeal is being made to people who are in the Western world might have come from an Islamic background of some kind, but it's directed at those people. It's not directed into the local home domestic markets, I don't think. I've been reading that fellow Paul Virilio, whom I mentioned in my article, and he says, in the era of globalization, a nation's borders are no longer external, but run through its cities. And in this piece, he says he's an impressive commentator on the conditioning power of the mass media and the way in which every shattering event, from natural catastrophes to the Columbia shuttle disaster and the attack on the Twin Towers, gets world coverage and is put on a loop. Our minds are literally besieged by these weapons of mass communication, as he calls them, creating a panic-driven tele-reality and resulting in an odd kind of emotional synchronization in which terror must be instantaneously felt by all on the scale of global terrorism. Virilio maintains that the global village has created hyper-terrorism as its integral accident, just as derailment is the integral accident of a train. The Pentagon is eager to exploit the audiovisual impact of real-time mass communication. Remember Saddam's statue being toppled. But unfortunately, so are the terrorists. The same impulse drives contemporary art, says Virilio, and he often returns to Stockhausen's incendiary remark that 9/11 was the greatest work of art ever. That took me to something else I was reading. As we can see, the post-9/11 doctrine of national security rests upon a pun. There is no such thing as an objectively secure world. Whether we feel secure or not is a matter of perception, or rather of sight. Then the Cato Institute's reporting the global war on terror has acquired a life of its own, says intelligence analyst Patrick Lang. It's a self-licking ice cream cone. I like this photograph taken in 1960 of Jack and Bobby Kennedy when they were alive. This a photograph of planes on deck at night somewhere off the Middle East. The chief executive of the French oil major Total, Christophe de Margerie, was killed when a business jet that he was flying in collided with a snowplow during takeoff at Moscow's Vnukovo International Airport. Moving on to the currency markets, Euro 128.21, dollar at 84.81, Japanese yen 106.35, Swissy 0.9411, the pound 161.82. You can see the dollar sold off against the high yielders. Aussie above 88.88111. India rupee 61.265, South Korean won 10.5405. That's improved as well. Rial 246.52. I think Dilma Rousseff is pulling ahead. Egyptian pound 714.84. South African rands firmer 1101.43. Obviously, people have rode back from expectations for an early rate hike strike from the Fed. Dallas Fed President, one of the hawks, Richard Fisher, said he continued to be hawkish on rates but wanted to be sensible. Of course, yields on US bonds have come down dramatically. 10-year touched 1.86%. It's at 2.19 last. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index. I think this is an opportunity now to re-enter on the long side. Euro dollar, I'll put up a 3-month chart. That's had a good rebound. I think that's going to peter out now. China's economy grew at the slowest pace in 5 years, but this was largely expected. They've been talking it down for a while. Gold pushed on to 1248.65. I'll put up a 6-month chart. I'm not a buyer into this. I think we're going to get another round of dollar strength, which will take gold back to 2014 lows. Crude oil, $82.19. It's, I think, at a 4-day high, but volumes have gone down considerably. The front month price is down 16% year to date, but if you look at where we were in June, we've had a much more dramatic fall. In a Bloomberg report, David Lennox from Fat Profits in Sydney says if OPEC doesn't cut, the market will go lower. I don't think they're going to cut. I think Saudi Arabia has made a geopolitical calculation. The US won't stop production as the supply-demand scenario affected the market, and I wrote about that in that piece, Who Kneecapped the Prices of Oil in the Global Markets, which I wrote a week ago. And essentially I was saying the Obama administration had done that. And then this is interesting. Oil is so much more than a fuel. It's a force even bigger than its $3.4 trillion market. It's a weapon, a strategic asset, a curse. It's a maker and spoiler of fortunes, a leading indicator and an echo chamber. I'll also put a 5-day chart up. I think, bounces here. I think we're headed a lot lower here. IMF has cut Africa's growth forecast amid the Ebola virus and insecurity, reduced its growth forecast in sub-Saharan Africa. It will expand 5% this year, the same as in 2013. IMF said today in April they'd forecast a 5.5% increase in GDP, so quite a sharp haircut they're taking. Low-income countries will spur expansion with growth of as much as 7% in 2014-2015. The Ebola outbreak could have much larger regional spillovers, especially if it is more protracted or spreads to other countries, with trade, tourism, and investment confidence severely affected. In Ebola-affected countries, fiscal accounts are likely to deteriorate, and where public debt is manageable, fiscal deficits should be allowed to widen temporarily. Talking about large macroeconomic imbalances in Ghana and Zambia. And then I've also put a link in for the actual report itself. Do have a look at it. They tend to be very insightful as to where the macro pieces are falling. Talking about the Ebola outbreak, homegrown fiscal vulnerabilities, external risks. Oxfam said Ebola could become the definitive humanitarian disaster of our generation. CEO Mark Goldring warned that the world was in the eye of a storm. We cannot allow Ebola to immobilize us in fear, but countries that have failed to commit troops, doctors, and enough funding are in danger of costing lives. The New Yorker has a very interesting piece about how the virus is extremely infectious. Experiments suggest that if one particle of Ebola enters a person's bloodstream, it can cause a fatal infection. A sample of the Ebola now raging in West Africa has, by recent count, 18,959 letters of code in its genome. This is a small genome by the measure of living things. Viruses like Ebola, which use RNA for their genetic code, are prone to making errors in the code as they multiply. These are called mutations. Right now, the virus's code is changing as Ebola enters a deepening relationship with the human species. The question of how it is mutating is significant for every person on Earth. Talking about viruses traveling through the air, and very interesting, worth having a look. The South African all-share is up 2.9034% this year, and at 7-month lows. We've corrected just under 5,000 points from an all-time high early in the year. Dollar rand, stronger rand, 11.0153. Egyptian pound, 7.1478. It's been probably the steadiest currency in the last 3 months or so. Moody's have raised Egypt's credit ratings to stable from negative. Egyptian stock market ticked higher marginally. It's at 3-month lows, but still up 25.833% year to date. But we were nearing 10,000. We're now at 8,534 last. Nigerian all-share snapped a losing streak to close up 1.22%. It's down 6.453% year to date, and at 6-month lows. Ghana up 3.216% year to date. The Ghana finance minister says he's confident the government can do a deal with the IMF in November. You will remember I did say a while back that the way to sort out Ghana was to dial up Madame Lagarde. They did. But they're still in negotiations. He's saying, the FinMin, yes, I'm confident of an IMF deal. You know why I'm confident. This is not the first program that Ghana has done. Ghana has done about 8 or 9 programs with the IMF since 1993, he said. Mozambique's National Electoral Commission said it expects to release final results before an October 30 deadline and pledged to investigate opposition allegations of rigging. In the presidential vote, this was at the last release on October 17, tallies from the first 51% of polling stations counted showed Frelimo candidate Felipe Nyusi leading with 62%, followed by Renamo's Afonso Dhlakama, you remember was holed up in the Gorongosa Mountains till about 6 weeks ago. He got 31%, and Davis Simango, leader of the Mozambique Democratic Movement, had 7%. Parliamentary elections for Lima had 63% of the vote from the first 36% of polling stations counted. Renamo 27%, MDM 8%. Daily Maverick has an interesting piece saying that although the final results are still to be released, it's already clear that Mozambique's ruling party has clung on to power by a comfortable margin. But they're saying this marks a precipitous drop in support, means the party has lost that precious two-thirds majority in parliament. Saying that, the juggernaut, this was not expected, these kinds of results, and that given that, they're going to have to take Frelimo a lot more seriously. Nyusi will have to deal with the reinvigorated Dhlakama on steroids, putting pressure to get more benefits. Renamo is looking to apply the South African band-aid, the magical ointment for all African problems, a government of national unity. This South African export sometimes works, but balloons government administration so that everyone gets a turn to eat. Clearly, Frelimo will not accept a unity government. I don't think they would. Banco Espírito Santo Angola is an isolated case, as the KPMG. Banco Espírito Santo Angola, whose loan losses prompted the African country's central bank to order it to raise capital, is an exception in an otherwise robust financial industry there, says Victor Ribeirinho, head of audit at KPMG in Portugal and Angola. It looks like an isolated case, he said. Angola says Novo Banco is to get a 9.9% stake in BS Angola after converting part of an interbank loan into capital. Coming to Kenya, Kenyan Somali soldiers killed 5 suspected Islamic extremist bombers attempting to cross into the country from Ethiopia in a car laden with explosives, and 6 suicide vests, a Kenyan military spokesman said Sunday. Bogita Ongeri said that authorities recovered 100 kilograms of TNT from the vehicle, which was intercepted at Dolo along Kenya's border with Ethiopia on Saturday. A friend of mine asked me how many of those cars would they have sent. They certainly wouldn't have just sent one. And last time they sent about 3. The Kenya police said to use shoot-to-kill policy to fight Islamists as Kenyan police seek to counter attacks by Islamist militants from neighbouring Somalia and crack down on spiralling crime. They're increasingly pursuing a policy of shoot first and ask questions later. Law enforcement officers have committed at least 176 summary executions so far this year, compared with 143 in the same period last year. Methods risk stoking public anxiety about insecurity among the general public and fueling sympathy for the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab militants. Extrajudicial killings are part of a tapestry of human rights abuses, which may feel like an appropriate short-term solution, but it's deeply misguided because it creates more instability, Horowitz said by phone from Zanzibar. The violations are taking place in the context of Kenyans combating terrorism, he said. Kenya shilling is at 89.05. Nairobi all shares up 17.3948% and 3.0401% below a record high set on the 23rd of last month. NSE 20 is up 7.166% and 127 points below 5,406, where it closed on the 22nd of September. That was a more than 6-year high. East African Breweries has laid off more than 100 employees, cutting its staff costs by nearly $1 billion. This is the senator's spillover fallout, and that has been entirely unfortunate. I did an interview on Nigerian radio today, and I'm just saying, Kenya's performed in a more resilient manner from a stock market perspective than Nigeria in particular, but I think there you've got oil price, you've got an election coming up and turning the markets defensive, and South Africa, frankly, anytime markets sell off globally, South Africa sells off with them. Once again, thank you for stopping by. Thoroughly appreciate it.